The press room at the Morley Aviation Headquarters hummed with the low drone of voices, punctuated by the occasional cough and the shuffle of papers. The air, thick with anticipation and the burnt coffee smell of overworked journalists, carried an unspoken tension. At the front of the room, a long mahogany table stood under the sharp glow of electric lamps. Behind it, a row of stiff-backed men in dark suits whispered among themselves, faces drawn tight. The Morley name meant money, and money meant scrutiny. A reporter from the Times flicked open his notepad. "What's the hold-up?" he muttered to no one in particular. "Something's off," a voice behind him whispered. "You can feel it." At exactly noon, a tall, sunken-eyed man in a three-piece suit stepped up to the podium. His name, Henry Blackwell, was stamped in every aviation contract signed in the last decade, though no one ever remembered his face. He cleared his throat. "It is with great difficulty that I announce—" He paused, steeling himself against the sudden hush in the room. "That Sir Alister Morley has disappeared under extraordinary circumstances. His aircraft was found crashed this morning at precisely 5:42 a.m. inside the central hangar at Morley Aviation's private airfield. However," he leaned forward, voice flattening into something that felt rehearsed, "his body was not found at the scene." The room cracked open like a gunshot. Shouts collided. "No body? What do you mean, inside the hangar?" While camera bulbs burst in flashes of white light. Blackwell raised a hand for silence. "Security footage confirms the hangar was locked from within. No one entered or exited. The doors remained bolted. Sir Morley's aircraft crashed inside a sealed facility." The murmurs turned frantic. The words hung in the stale air, the weight of them sinking in. A locked room. An impossible crash. No body. A young journalist with slicked-back hair leaned forward. "Are you saying he vanished into thin air?" Blackwell hesitated, just long enough for the room to smell blood. "I am saying," he adjusted his tie, "that this is an ongoing investigation, and we will provide further details in due course." The words were meant to end the conversation. They didn't. The murmurs swelled into a tide of speculation, fear, and something more dangerous. Excitement. The impossible was always thrilling. Until someone had to explain it. The Morley Aviation private airfield lay under a bruised morning sky, the first rays of sun creeping over the glass and steel hangars. Beyond the chain-link fences and the perfectly paved runways, rolling English countryside stretched outward, indifferent to the steel bones of progress. Inside Hangar 3, the air was different. Thick, sterile, wrong. A handful of men stood in the yawning space, dwarfed by the great iron ribs of the structure. The aircraft, a sleek silver monoplane, sat in the centre, its nose crumpled against the polished floor, wings splayed at unnatural angles. The impact should have shattered glass, shredded steel. It hadn't. The wreckage was too neat, like it had been placed there, not fallen. Two investigators crouched near the landing gear, murmuring over something smeared across the floor. A third man, in an inspector's coat, frowned up at the hangar door. Bolted from the inside. His fingers trailed along the edges of the locking mechanism, coming away greasy. "What is that?" one of the men asked. "Not oil. Something else." The inspector rubbed his thumb against his fingertips. "Feels almost synthetic." Across the room, an emergency responder pulled off his cap, running a hand through damp hair. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of tampering, no forced entry. He exhaled through his nose. "Sir Morley's not here, and there's no damn way he left." The words settled heavy in the space. One of the engineers, an older man with a weathered face, spoke up, voice hesitant. "That don't make sense, though." The inspector shot him a glance. The engineer gestured toward the plane. "He crashed, right? Then where's the blood?" Heads turned. The wreckage had all the hallmarks of disaster. Twisted metal, shattered glass, but none of the aftermath. No blood. No human wreckage. The inspector straightened, glancing back toward the door. "There's an answer to this," he muttered. "There's always an answer." Somewhere near the entrance, the shadow of a figure lingered, just long enough to watch the puzzle unfold, before slipping away into the morning mist. St. Mary Mead was the kind of village that seemed to exist outside of time, untouched by the rush of modernity. The houses sat neatly along winding lanes, their gardens precise, their doors freshly painted. The baker's shop on the square smelled of warm bread, and the post office still hand-stamped its letters. A world in miniature, complete with its own set of dramas, whispered behind lace curtains. Inside a modest but well-kept cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat by the window, a cup of tea cooling beside her. A well-thumbed novel lay open on the table. Wilkie Collins, a proper puzzle, the kind she appreciated. The trouble with real mysteries, of course, was that they didn't always come with neat resolutions. Outside, the morning stretched quiet and predictable. Mrs. Calthorpe shuffled past with her Pekingese, looking as scandalized as ever. Young Tommy Wheeler cycled down the lane, delivering milk with the reckless energy of youth. The butcher's boy was arguing with old Mrs. Fitzwilliam over the price of lamb, as he did every Tuesday. The world continued in its small, comfortable patterns. Miss Marple turned a page, but she wasn't reading. She'd had a feeling all morning, a whisper of unease, the sense that something in the air was off-kilter. It was an instinct she had learned to trust. The knock at the door came just as she reached for her tea. It wasn't a visitor's knock, not the hesitant tap of Mrs. Harmon calling for a recipe, nor the brisk rap of the vicar's wife on one of her crusades against immodesty. This was different, efficient, discreet. She unfolded herself from the chair and crossed to the door, her steps light despite her years. When she opened it, the postman stood there, looking mildly apologetic. "Telegram for you, Miss Marple," he said, holding it out. She took it, nodding her thanks, and closed the door before he could start speculating. The villagers would find out soon enough. Bad news travelled fast in St. Mary Mead, faster than the London Express. She sat down again, smoothing out the yellow paper with careful fingers. Telegrams were rarely good news. They were too urgent for anything trivial. "Miss Marple, urgent matter requiring your attention. Stop. Sir Alastair Morley, missing after impossible crash. Stop. Inquiry requested at Morley Aviation. Stop. Details to follow. Stop. Black Well." She read it twice, lips pressing together. Sir Alastair Morley, that was a name she hadn't heard in years. A brilliant aviator, but also a man of considerable arrogance. She remembered him from a garden party once, all sharp wit and sharper elbows. He had a way of making people feel small, of commanding attention without earning it. Some men were like that. Now he was missing. Miss Marple set the telegram down beside her book and picked up her tea. It had gone cold. "An impossible crash," she murmured. Impossible things had a way of turning out quite possible once you looked at them properly. A man couldn't vanish into thin air. There was always a trick, always a seam where reality frayed at the edges. The question wasn't if there was an explanation. The question was who had gone to such trouble to make it look otherwise. She sat back, considering. There had been other cases. A locked-room poisoning in Sussex, a vanished heir in Kensington, mysteries that on first glance seemed insurmountable, but in the end came down to something simple: human nature. Greed, jealousy, fear, the same forces that stirred in a small village, stirred in boardrooms, in city streets, in high city hangars. The only difference was the scale. Miss Marple had never been to Morley Aviation, but she could picture it. The gleaming metal of aircraft, the clipped voices of engineers, the meticulous order of a place built on precision. And now, somewhere in the midst of all that control, was a single, glaring mistake. She sipped her cold tea. Outside, the village went on as it always did. The bells of St. Mary's chimed the hour. A door slammed down the lane. The butcher's boy finally gave up arguing and handed over the lamb. Life continued, orderly as ever. But something had changed. Miss Marple placed the telegram carefully in her book and stood. It seemed she had a journey to make. The train pulled out of St. Mary Mead's modest station with a low mechanical groan, gathering speed as it cut through the rolling green of the English countryside. Miss Marple sat near the window, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, watching hedgerows blur past. The locomotive rocked gently, the steady clack-clack of iron wheels on rails filling the space between murmured conversations and the occasional clink of teacups. The compartment smelled of old leather and polished wood, with a faint undercurrent of damp wool from a gentleman's overcoat hung too close to the heater. It was a comfortable space, but not a relaxed one. There was something in the air, an unease, threading through the passengers like a silent draught. Miss Marple wasn't alone in her compartment. Across from her, a well-dressed woman in a fur-trimmed coat kept adjusting the pearls at her throat, a nervous habit. To her left, a man in a dark overcoat flipped absently through the Times, though he hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Further down, a younger man with sharp features and a pencil-thin moustache tapped his fingers against his knee in a syncopated rhythm, his restless energy at odds with the otherwise subdued atmosphere. Miss Marple, knitting half-finished in her lap, observed without seeming to. It was something she had mastered over the years, the ability to listen without drawing attention, to see without being seen. People spoke more freely when they thought no one of consequence was listening. She wasn't disappointed. "You mark my words," the pearl-clutching woman said to her companion, a plump, ruddy-cheeked man who seemed more interested in his newspaper than her opinions. "This isn't just an accident." Her voice was low but urgent. "They're saying Sir Morley's disappearance has implications." The man sighed. "You read too much into things, Margaret." "Do I?" The woman's eyes narrowed. "The plane crashes inside a locked hangar and he's nowhere to be found? Doesn't that seem rather convenient? And now the government is involved?" She shook her head. "It's not right." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her knitting. The government? That was a new wrinkle. Further down the carriage, the younger man with the moustache chuckled under his breath. "The government's always involved," he muttered, mostly to himself. "It depends on who they're covering for." The pearl-clutching woman turned sharply. "And what do you mean by that, sir?" The young man shrugged. "Only that Morley wasn't exactly a saint. He had friends in high places, and enemies even higher. A man like that doesn't just vanish unless someone wants him to." The ruddy-cheeked man folded his newspaper with an air of finality. "That's enough nonsense for one morning." But the damage was done. The words lingered in the air, leaving an aftertaste of suspicion. Miss Marple resumed knitting, mind working. Sir Alistair Morley was well connected, certainly. His name carried weight in the aviation world, and with weight came power, and with power, enemies. The train rattled on. Outside the window, the countryside gave way to industry. Tall chimneys and the skeletal frames of half-built factories signalling a shift in landscape. The air seemed to change too, thickening with the scent of coal and iron. They were nearing London's outskirts, and beyond that the Morley Aviation Facility. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing against the telegram tucked in her sleeve. An impossible crash. A missing man. And now whispers of something more than mere misfortune. She had always believed in patterns, in the small threads that wove together to form a larger picture, and something told her that the picture forming now was not one of simple tragedy. The train's whistle blew, long and low, as the station loomed into view. It was time to step into the puzzle. The Morley Aviation Facility loomed against the dimming sky, all sharp edges and cold steel, a monument to modern engineering that looked out of place against the soft, rolling countryside. The main building stood 3 stories high, a fortress of glass and metal, while the hangars stretched out behind it, their wide doors shut tight. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, painting everything in deep blues and burnt orange. Miss Marple stepped out of the motor car that had been arranged for her, A sleek, black vehicle driven by a tight-lipped young man who barely spoke on the way from the station. The air smelled of machine oil and cooling metal. Somewhere in the distance, a lone aircraft engine hummed before winding down to silence. She adjusted her gloves, taking in the scene. A man was waiting for her at the entrance, hands clasped behind his back. Thin, well-dressed, but not in the expensive way. More like a man who cared about appearances but had no particular wealth of his own. His hair, combed back with too much oil, gleamed under the electric lights above the doorway. His eyes, however, were restless. "Miss Marple, I presume?" His voice was clipped, practised. "You presume correctly," she said, stepping forward. "And you?" "You are?" "Howard Finch, facility manager." He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "I've been asked to assist you in any way necessary." "Ah, that sounds rather accommodating," she said lightly, brushing past him into the entrance hall. Inside, the facility was all glass and steel, pristine but impersonal, the kind of place that valued efficiency over comfort. The floors gleamed, the walls were spotless, but the air had the feel of something unfinished, like a house where no one had settled in. Finch followed beside her, his steps precise. "I understand you have been asked to look into Sir Morley's disappearance." "Yes?" She paused, eyes sweeping the hallway. A desk stood against the far wall, a stack of files left haphazardly on top. A woman in a crisp blouse and skirt was hurriedly locking a filing cabinet, her hands moving just a little too fast. She glanced up at them, then back down, turning the key sharply before tucking it into her pocket. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Your staff seems quite busy." "Security measures," Finch said smoothly. "We have to be careful, given the circumstances." "Of course." She nodded toward the locked cabinet. "I suppose Sir Morley's records would be in there?" Finch's mouth twitched. "That's confidential." Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile. Naturally. They moved through the hallway, past a set of tall windows that looked out toward the hangars. Beyond the glass, the massive doors of Hangar 3 were sealed shut. A single lantern flickered near the entrance, casting jittery light over the concrete. She noted the details quietly. Oil stains along the threshold, scuff marks near the base of the door, signs of movement. "How many people have access to the hangars?" she asked. Finch hesitated again. "Only authorized personnel." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she let a small silence stretch between them. Finch cleared his throat. There was some unusual maintenance work scheduled the night before the crash. "Oh, routine, of course," he said quickly, "but still, the timing is unfortunate." "I see." She smoothed a hand over her handbag. "I suppose I should speak with whoever scheduled it." Finch gave a thin smile. "I'll see what I can do." Miss Marple inclined her head, watching the nervous way his fingers curled at his sides. "Yes," she said gently. "I rather think you will." The air inside Hangar 3 was thick with the scent of metal and fuel, a mixture that clung to the walls like a memory. The cavernous space swallowed sounds, making every footstep feel heavier, every breath more deliberate. Overhead, security lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow that sharpened the edges of everything. Steel beams, polished floors, the wreckage of Sir Alistair Morley's plane. Miss Marple stood near the entrance, hands clasped in front of her, eyes moving slowly over the scene. The monoplane lay at an awkward angle, its nose crumpled from impact, wings bent inward like broken limbs. But there was something off about the damage. Too contained, too neat. No sign of violent shattering. No twisted metal scattered in chaotic ruin. Just a carefully confined wreck. Behind her, Finch shifted, clearing his throat. "I don't suppose you've seen an aircraft crash before, Miss Marple?" She didn't look at him. "Not personally, no." She stepped forward, the sound of her sensible shoes tapping against the smooth concrete. "Though I have seen the results of well-planned destruction before. Quite a different thing from an accident." Finch gave a tight smile. "We're still determining the cause." "Yes," she murmured, stopping just shy of the plane's battered fuselage. "I imagine you are." To her right, two investigators stood by a control panel, exchanging clipped words. A young man in coveralls knelt near the hangar doors, running gloved fingers along the locking mechanism. His expression was taut with confusion. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "That's an unusual amount of interest in a door, wouldn't you say?" Finch exhaled sharply. It was sealed. From the inside. She looked up at him, eyes sharp. "Locked, you mean?" "Yes." His voice had the weight of someone reluctant to admit something impossible. "When security arrived, the hangar was locked. No one came in, no one went out, and yet—" He gestured toward the wreckage. "No, Sir Morley," Miss Marple finished for him. Finch nodded. She turned back to the plane, crouching slightly. The concrete beneath it was clean, no drag marks, no blood. It looked placed rather than fallen, like a child's toy set down with care. She reached into her handbag, retrieving a small handkerchief, and pressed it lightly against the floor just beside the wreck. When she lifted it, a thin smear of something dark and glossy clung to the fabric. Miss Marple studied it, turning the cloth slightly. The substance caught the light, a slick synthetic sheen, not oil, not fuel, something engineered. She straightened, tucking the handkerchief away. "I imagine your forensic team has noted this already," she said, voice mild. Finch's face was carefully blank. "We're looking into it." "Yes?" she said again, stepping back. "I imagine you are." Her eyes moved to the hangar walls, tracing their smooth, industrial finish. The space was designed to be secure, a controlled environment where nothing happened by chance, but security, she had learned, was only as good as the people who built it. Her gaze landed on a section of the far wall, just beneath the high metal rafters. A faint line ran along the surface. Something subtle, almost imperceptible. A seam. Miss Marple walked toward it slowly, adjusting her shawl. "What's over there?" she asked. Finch followed her gaze. "Just the ventilation system. Maintenance access is external." "Of course," she murmured, eyes narrowing. The seam was clean, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. A deliberate construction. She glanced back at Finch. "Who has access to the maintenance records?" He hesitated. "I'll have to check," Miss Marple smiled, thin and polite. "I imagine you will." She turned back to the wall, fingers tapping lightly against the cool surface. "A ventilation shaft, narrow, concealed, and possibly just large enough for someone desperate enough. An impossible crime always had a method, and this one was starting to reveal its shape." Sir Alister Morley's office smelled of leather, ink, and the faint trace of cigar smoke that had long since settled into the furniture. It was the sort of room designed to impress. Mahogany-panelled walls lined with books on aviation, framed photographs of Morley shaking hands with ministers and foreign dignitaries, and a polished desk large enough to suggest a man who made decisions. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway, hands folded neatly over her handbag, taking in the room with the practiced patience of someone who understood that the smallest detail could be the loudest clue. A place like this was meant to tell a story. It was meant to shape an image. Successful, meticulous, powerful. And yet beneath all the carefully curated authority, there was something else. The air was still, too still, like the room was holding its breath. Finch, the facility manager, lingered near the window, shifting his weight. "Sir Morley was a private man," he said. "But he spent a great deal of time here, late nights, early mornings. It was more than just an office." Miss Marple glanced at the desk. Papers were stacked in crisp piles. An empty glass rested on a leather coaster, and a heavy brass pen set perfectly centered on a blotter. Everything was in order. "Too much order." She stepped forward, her fingers skimming the edge of the desk. "Did he have any particular habits?" Finch hesitated. He kept records of everything. Notes, appointments, personal reflections. But the night before the crash, some of his papers went missing. Miss Marple lifted an eyebrow. "How curious." She opened the desk drawer. Inside there was the usual. Ledgers, a silver letter opener, a box of expensive cigars. She picked up a small stack of letters, skimming the top one. Nothing unusual. Then Beneath them she found something different, a scrap of paper, edges charred, a burned note. She lifted it carefully, turning it in the light. The handwriting, though partly destroyed, was unmistakably Sir Morley's. Silent hanger, hidden passages. The words stood out stark against the damaged page. The edges of the paper were curled, burned just enough to obscure meaning, but not enough to erase the warning. Miss Marple turned to Finch. "Where was this found?" He cleared his throat. "Inside the fireplace. It hadn't burned completely." She studied it again, piecing together what was left. The phrasing was deliberate. Not a silent hanger. The silent hanger. A specific place, a warning or a clue, and hidden passages. Plural. A suggestion of something unseen, something designed to be unnoticed. A puzzle. Miss Marple tucked the note into her handbag and let her mind work backward. If Morley had written this, he had been concerned about something. Concerned enough to destroy the evidence. But why burn it only halfway? That suggested he had been interrupted. She glanced at the room again, this time with a different eye. The bookshelves, the heavy curtains, the locked cabinet in the corner. She imagined Sir Morley late at night, alone in this room, penning this note with urgency, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. Then something had changed. Someone had come, or something had spooked him. He had thrown the note into the fire, but not fast enough. Miss Marple turned toward Finch. "Who was the last person to see Sir Morley before the crash?" He hesitated. "His business partner, I suppose, Julian Blake." Her lips pressed together. Julian Blake, a man known for charm and calculation in equal measure. Finch shifted again. "Do you think the note means something?" Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Mr. Finch, everything means something." She turned back to the room, gaze lingering on the empty glass on the desk, the careful arrangement of papers. The scene had been set, curated, but something was missing, something that had been here before the fire, before the crash. Sir Morley had left a message. He had tried to erase it. But the truth had a way of surviving. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and stepped toward the door. "I should like to speak with Mr. Blake." Finch nodded, though his expression was wary. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the burned note inside her handbag. A silent hanger, hidden passages. Sir Morley had known something, and someone had wanted to make sure he never spoke about it. The interview room was small, plain, and just uncomfortable enough to make people talk. A single wooden table stood in the centre, its surface scratched from years of restless fingers drumming against it. A dull electric light buzzed overhead, throwing stark shadows against the walls. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and burnt tobacco. Miss Marple sat at one end of the table, her gloved hands folded neatly over a leather notebook. Finch, the facility manager, hovered near the door, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The first suspect was already waiting. Julian Blake walked in like he owned the place. He was a man in his early 50s, with silvered hair that had been combed into submission, and a suit tailored just enough to suggest money, but not enough to suggest extravagance. He had the easy confidence of someone used to handling people, but the sharpness in his eyes gave him away. This was a man who didn't trust easily. He took his seat with a practised smile. "Miss Marple, is it?" She gave a pleasant nod. "Mr. Blake, thank you for speaking with me. Anything to assist the investigation, of course." He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. "Terrible business, all of this." "Yes," she agreed mildly. "Terrible." She let the silence stretch, watching as he filled it. "I'd only spoken to Alistair briefly the day before," Blake continued, smoothing the cuffs of his shirt, and was in good spirits, focused on work as always. We discussed the latest funding proposals, and then he left for the hangar. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "You're quite sure?" A pause. Just a flicker, then the smile again. "Of course, I had dinner with some associates afterward. A late night, but uneventful." She tapped her fingers lightly against the table. "I imagine the investigators have verified that." "They have," he said smoothly. Miss Marple gave him the kind of smile one might give a child insisting that 2 + 2 = 5. "Curious, though." Blake's expression flickered again. What is? That you had a dinner engagement at the same time Morley was working late, and yet, according to Finch here, no one else at the facility saw Morley after a certain hour. I wonder... How long did you wait before leaving for dinner? Blake's fingers tensed against the arm of his chair, just for a moment. Well, I had matters to attend to, business. I don't account for every minute of my schedule, Miss Marple. No, she said softly. I rather suspect you don't. She closed her notebook. That will be all for now, Mr. Blake. Blake hesitated, then stood. Of course, if you need anything else. She simply nodded, already making notes as he left the room. Lillian Morley arrived with a cigarette held between two perfectly manicured fingers. She was striking in an austere sort of way, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes, a dress that was fashionable without being gaudy, a widow in all but legality. She took a long drag before sitting down. I won't pretend to be heartbroken. Miss Marple nodded. No, I rather thought not. Lillian exhaled smoke in a slow, measured stream. Alistair and I hadn't spoken in months. I imagine you've already been told that. Our marriage was functionally over, and yet still married. Lillian's lips curved slightly. Yes, technically. Any financial discussions between you recently? The smile didn't falter, but there was something colder in it now. A few. He wanted a divorce. I wanted my share of his fortune. We were negotiating. Miss Marple adjusted the notebook in her lap. Negotiations can be quite unpleasant, I imagine. Oh, quite. Another drag of the cigarette. But I'm no fool, Miss Marple. If I wanted Alistair dead, I wouldn't have waited until he conveniently vanished in an impossible locked-room scenario. A little poison in his brandy would have been far less dramatic. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. And yet you don't seem particularly surprised that he's missing. Lillian let the cigarette smoulder between her fingers. He had enemies, Miss Marple, and if you think I'm the most dangerous one, then you haven't been looking hard enough. Miss Marple gave her a long, thoughtful look. Then, gently, And where were you the night of the crash? Lillian smiled. At the theatre, with witnesses. Miss Marple nodded. How fortunate. Lillian stood. Is that all? That all? Lillian flicked the cigarette into the ashtray and left without another word. Richard Hale was young, restless, and already annoyed when he sat down. This is a waste of time, he said. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. Is it? Hale crossed his arms. He was the type who carried tension in his shoulders, always on edge. Look, I had nothing to do with Morley's disappearance. Did you dislike him? Hale let out a sharp laugh. Sure, who didn't? The man treated everyone like they were beneath him, but that doesn't mean I wanted him dead. Miss Marple nodded. And yet there was quite a bit of bad blood between you. Hale's jaw clenched. He stole my designs, my prototype, took credit for things he had no right to. She jotted something down. That must have made you very angry. His fingers curled into fists. I wanted him ruined, Miss Marple, not dead. A very fine distinction, Hale exhaled sharply. You're looking at the wrong people. Morley was involved in something bigger than me or Blake or his damned wife. I'd bet money on it. Miss Marple closed her notebook. I do appreciate a gambler, Mr. Hale. Whittaker had the stillness of a man who knew too much. He sat perfectly upright, expression unreadable, his hands folded neatly on the table. Miss Marple, he greeted evenly. Mr. Whittaker, she returned. I assume you have questions? Only a few. He inclined his head. Then I'll answer what I can. She studied him. You were here the night of the crash. Yes. You had business with Morley? Classified business. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet you won't deny it. Whittaker's lips twitched. I have no reason to. Then you must have some insight into his disappearance. A pause. I suspect you already know more than you let on, Miss Marple. She smiled. Perhaps. But I do enjoy confirmation. Whittaker leaned forward slightly. Morley was useful to certain people, and a threat to others. That's all I can say. Miss Marple studied him. I imagine it is." She jotted something down. "That will be all, Mr. Whittaker." He stood without hesitation and left. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, then glanced down at her notes. A series of half-truths, carefully chosen words, and just enough guilt in the air to make the whole room feel heavy. She tapped her pen against the table. Morley had made enemies, and one of them had made sure he disappeared. The Morley Aviation Facility had a different character at night. The noise of the day, voices, engines, the constant thrum of work, had faded into silence. Only the distant hum of a security generator and the occasional metallic creak of settling steel broke the stillness. The air smelled of oil and cold metal. The vast hangars stood dark and quiet, their presence looming under the moonlight. Miss Marple moved carefully, her footsteps light on the concrete floor of Hangar 3. Finch had tried to insist that she wait until morning, but she had waved him off with a polite smile. Mysteries had a way of hiding in the shadows, and she preferred to meet them on their own terms. She paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust. The security lights cast long, stark shadows, making every shape more pronounced, every movement feel like something shifting in the dark. The wrecked plane sat where it had before, broken, but too neatly so. She retraced her steps from earlier that day, her mind working in quiet precision. The details of the crime scene were still fresh, and she had the unsettling sense that the answers were just out of reach, hovering like a thread waiting to be pulled. She walked to the far side of the hangar, past the mechanical storage area, stopping in front of the ventilation panel she had noticed before. During the day it had seemed unremarkable, a functional part of the building. Now, in the silence, it stood out. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and retrieved a small pocket torch, clicking it on. The beam cut across the metal surface, revealing what she had suspected. The edges of the vent bore faint scuff marks, the kind left by hurried hands unscrewing bolts. She set her torch down and pressed against the panel. It shifted slightly, not locked. Miss Marple glanced back at the hangar entrance, still quiet. Then, with careful fingers, she pried the panel open. The space beyond was just large enough for a person, if they were determined. The shaft stretched back into the building's ventilation system, disappearing into darkness. She nodded to herself. So much for an impossible crime. Carefully, she pulled the panel back into place, leaving it just as she had found it. The trick wasn't just in seeing the answer, but in knowing when to let others believe it was still hidden. She turned, slipping her torch back into her handbag. Her suspicions were confirmed. Now she just needed proof. The makeshift forensic lab was tucked away in an unused wing of the facility, an afterthought of a space with a single long table, old filing cabinets, and overhead fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to feel unsettling. The walls were yellowed from time, and the air carried the scent of old paper and industrial solvents. A young technician named Harris sat at the table, sleeves rolled up, eyes narrowed as he worked under a magnifying glass. He had the look of a man who was used to being ignored, sharp, observant, and slightly resentful of it. Miss Marple stood beside him, watching as he carefully examined the residue she had collected. He grunted. "You were right. This isn't standard aviation lubricant." "Oh." Harris adjusted the lens, frowning. "It's a high-performance compound used in precision mechanical systems. Stuff like this isn't common, only found in experimental designs." Miss Marple tilted her head. "So not something that would normally be in a maintenance hangar." "Not unless someone put it there on purpose." She nodded, thoughtful. "And do you happen to know who would have access to such a thing?" Harris sighed, pulling a file toward him. "There is only one maintenance request that involved this compound in the last 6 months. A week ago. Scheduled by Julian Blake." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but there was a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She looked up as the fluorescent light flickered again, casting odd shadows against the wall. A mechanical failure or something else. No matter. The pieces were falling into place now. She reached into her handbag, retrieving her notebook, and jotted a single note. Julian Blake had planned something, and she was beginning to see exactly what. The conference room at the Morley Aviation Facility was a study in controlled discomfort. Dim lighting cast deep shadows over the long oak table, the only sound the slow tick of the wall clock. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. The walls, lined with faded aviation blueprints, seemed to close in as the tension thickened. Miss Marple sat at one end, her small frame deceptive in its stillness. She folded her hands over her notebook, eyes moving from one suspect to the next. They were all here. Julian Blake, the business partner, Lillian Morley, the estranged wife, Richard Hale, the rival pilot, and Charles Whittaker, the government agent. Howard Finch, the facility manager, leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, as if hoping he could disappear into the woodwork. Miss Marple's voice was pleasant, almost conversational. "I thought it would be helpful to go over everyone's whereabouts the night of Sir Morley's disappearance." Blake smirked. "Haven't we already done this?" She smiled back. "Not quite." She turned a page in her notebook. "Mr. Blake, you mentioned that you had dinner with associates the night of the incident. You left the facility at what time?" Blake's confidence wavered. "Just a hair." 7:30, perhaps closer to 8. Miss Marple nodded. "And the maintenance logs show you accessed the engineering wing at precisely 7:12 p.m. Blake's eyes narrowed. "Yes, I had paperwork to finalize." "Indeed!" She tilted her head. "That's rather fortunate timing." Blake exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. "I don't see how." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. "Well, the hangar's security logs show that the access codes were disabled at 7:15 p.m. That would mean someone inside had overridden them manually." Blake went still. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. "Which means, of course, that whoever was inside the hangar at that moment had the ability to make it appear sealed from within." Lillian Morley tapped ash from her cigarette into a crystal tray. "Sounds damning," she murmured, not looking up. Blake forced a smile. "Are you suggesting I locked Morley in the hangar and staged the crash?" Miss Marple returned his smile, but hers had something sharper behind it. "Not at all. I'm simply saying that you were in a very convenient position to do so." The room held its breath. Blake's jaw tightened. Miss Marple turned to Finch. "Do the maintenance logs indicate what Mr. Blake was working on?" Finch hesitated. "It was a request for an equipment update, something about recalibrating the security system for the hangar doors." Miss Marple sighed. "Well, that is interesting, isn't it?" Blake opened his mouth, then closed it. Miss Marple let the silence stretch just long enough before she stood, smoothing her skirt. "Let's take a short break. I'm sure Mr. Blake would like a moment to gather his thoughts." No one spoke as she exited the room. The corridor was dimly lit, the walls narrow, the silence thick. Somewhere far off, the hum of an engine rumbled low, steady. The facility had a way of making people feel small, as if the metal and machinery had swallowed them whole. Miss Marple stood in the centre of it, waiting. Charles Whittaker emerged from the conference room last, his movements slow and deliberate. He saw her standing there and hesitated for the briefest second. Then he walked toward her, calm as ever. "Miss Marple," he said evenly. "Mr. Whittaker?" She watched him, noting the way his shoulders stayed squared, the way his hands remained still at his sides. A man who trained himself not to show anything. "I wonder," she said, voice light, "if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity?" Whittaker gave her the kind of smile a man gives when he's measuring his words carefully. "I'd be happy to, within reason." "How familiar were you with Sir Morley's unofficial activities?" A pause, not long, but noticeable. "Unofficial?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Oh, come now, Mr. Whittaker. You didn't happen to be present the night of the crash by accident. Men in your position don't linger without reason." Whittaker's jaw tightened slightly. She continued, pleasant but unyielding. "And I do wonder if Morley was involved in something sensitive, perhaps even illegal. What might happen if someone decided he was more useful missing than present?" Whittaker exhaled slowly. "You ask very dangerous questions, Miss Marple." She smiled, "and you answer them very carefully." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Whittaker's voice dropped just enough to sound like a warning. "Morley had connections, the kind that don't like exposure." "I imagine not." He met her gaze. "Some doors should stay closed." Miss Marple nodded, as if considering it. Then she said, "And some doors, like the hangars, aren't as closed as people like to believe." Whittaker's expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Miss Marple straightened her gloves. "I believe we'll be seeing more of each other very soon, Mr. Whittaker." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the dim corridor, his carefully composed mask beginning to crack. The heart of Hangar 3 was no longer just an aircraft storage space. Under the harsh glare of overhead lights, it had been transformed into something else. Part interrogation chamber, part courtroom. A long metal table sat at the centre, surrounded by scattered chairs, an impromptu arrangement that did little to make anyone comfortable. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, small and unassuming, but there was something in her stance that made people sit straighter, shift uneasily. The suspects were assembled. Julian Blake, his business partner, lounged back in his chair with the forced ease of a man who knew he was running out of places to hide. Lillian Morley, the estranged wife, sat with her arms crossed, a cigarette between her fingers, her expression carefully bored. Richard Hale, the rival pilot, drummed his fingers on his knee, barely containing his agitation. Charles Whittaker, the government agent, was silent, watching, his face unreadable. Howard Finch, the facility manager, stood near the hangar doors, looking like he wanted to melt into the background. Miss Marple gave the room a pleasant, almost grandmotherly smile. Then she spoke. "I imagine you're all wondering why I've gathered you here." No one answered. No one was foolish enough to speak first. She glanced down at her notebook, flipping a page with unhurried precision. "It has been a rather troubling mystery, hasn't it? A plane crashes inside a locked hangar. The pilot, Sir Alistair Morley, vanishes without a trace, and yet nothing about it makes sense. Until, of course, you begin looking in the right places." She looked up, settling her gaze on Blake. "For instance, the matter of the maintenance logs." Blake's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "What about them?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Instinct who filed a request for maintenance work on the security system of this hangar. That request was conveniently scheduled for the same evening Sir Morley disappeared. That in itself was suspicious." Blake let out a small laugh. "Really, Miss Marple, scheduling maintenance is hardly a crime." "Perhaps not, but choosing to do so at precisely the right moment is rather interesting." She turned slightly, her focus shifting to the others. "Now that alone wasn't enough, of course, but then there was the matter of the ventilation shaft." Hale sat up slightly. "The ventilation shaft?" "Yes," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "The one just large enough for a man to slip through. You see, the locked door mystery was never really about how Sir Morley's plane crashed inside the hangar. It was about how someone made sure no one could follow the trail." She turned back to Blake. "It's an old trick, really. A bit of misdirection. Make the crime look impossible, and people stop looking for a simple answer." Blake's jaw tightened. Miss Marple continued as if she hadn't noticed. "The lubricant residue was another interesting touch. High performance, used in specialized machinery. The kind not meant to be anywhere near an aircraft hangar." She turned a page in her notebook. "And yet it was found near the hangar door's locking mechanism, a substance so particular that it could only be traced to one recent maintenance request." She glanced up. "Yours, Mr. Blake." Blake exhaled sharply, but before he could speak, she continued. "And then, of course, there was the note." Lillian flicked ash from her cigarette. "That note?" Miss Marple smiled. "A rather charred one, I'm afraid, found in Sir Morley's office fireplace. It mentioned a silent hangar and hidden passages." She let that settle. "Sir Morley knew something," she said quietly, "and he was afraid." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with realization. Then Whittaker spoke. "And what exactly are you saying, Miss Marple?" She looked at him, her voice still calm, still polite. I am saying, Mr. Whittaker, that Julian Blake orchestrated a cover-up. He made sure that no one could follow the evidence, but he underestimated one thing." Blake's fingers curled against the table. "And what's that?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. "That nothing ever truly disappears." The air in Hangar 3 had thickened, weighed down by the tension that settled like dust in the corners. The overhead lights hummed, casting harsh pools of white onto the concrete floor. The wreckage of Sir Morley's plane sat in its designated ruin, a silent witness to the crime that had been spun into something impossible. Miss Marple stood at the centre of it all, hands folded in front of her, a picture of quiet authority. She had seen drawing rooms more hostile than this. A mystery unravelled itself in layers, but human nature, greedy, desperate, afraid, remained the same, whether it played out in a village parlour or an industrial hangar. A sound echoed in the distance. Footsteps steady and deliberate. Somewhere beyond the metal walls the world continued as if nothing had happened. But in here the room had become a noose, tightening around the guilty. She turned her gaze toward Julian Blake. He had been calm before, but now his fingers twitched against the tabletop. A man who knew the game was nearly up. Beside him, Charles Whittaker was rigid, his carefully composed mask beginning to fracture at the edges. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "It was rather clever, really," she said, her voice mild, almost conversational. "An impossible crime, a locked hangar, a missing man. It seemed as though Sir Morley had simply vanished into thin air." No one spoke. She wasn't expecting them to. But it was never about making him disappear, was it? She glanced at Blake. It was about making sure no one ever found what he knew. Blake's mouth pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple continued, her voice even. "Sir Morley had uncovered something dangerous. A set of experimental aviation designs, I imagine, possibly a project that would have cost some very powerful people a great deal of money if it were exposed." Whittaker's jaw clenched. She nodded slightly. "Yes, that does seem about right." She turned back to Blake. "You were the one who handled the financial side of things. You knew how much was at stake, and you knew Sir Morley wouldn't be silenced with money." Blake exhaled, slow and measured. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" She gave him a small, pleasant smile. "You and Mr. Whittaker had a very specific problem. You couldn't simply remove Sir Morley without drawing suspicion, so you created something else, a mystery." She gestured toward the ventilation shaft on the far wall. "The answer was always in the details, the locked hangar, the missing body. It was meant to look impossible. And people are drawn to the impossible. They look in the wrong places, search for solutions that don't exist." Her voice sharpened. "But it was never a locked-room mystery, not really." She walked slowly toward the wall, placing her palm against the barely visible seam of the ventilation shaft. "Sir Morley never left the hangar. He was removed." Blake scoffed. "You expect us to believe someone dragged a full-grown man through an air duct?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not dragged, assisted." She let the silence settle before continuing. "You tampered with the security systems, ensuring that the hangar would appear sealed. Meanwhile, the ventilation shaft provided the perfect escape route, one that had been altered just enough to make extraction possible." Finch, who had been standing off to the side, shifted uneasily. "But the lubricant, yes." Miss Marple nodded. "The high-performance lubricant, a specialty compound found only in cutting-edge aviation mechanisms, and yet it was found smeared along the ventilation shaft's inner panel and, curiously, near the hangar's locking system." She turned back to Blake. "You scheduled a maintenance update for that very night. You had access. You ensured the locks would disengage at the right moment." Blake said nothing. Miss Marple clasped her hands. Once Sir Morley was dealt with, the body was extracted through the shaft, and the scene was manipulated to appear unsolvable. Her voice dropped slightly. "But there's always something left behind, isn't there?" She turned to Whittaker. You were here that night, Mr. Whittaker. You were part of this. You helped to ensure that no official inquiry would ever reach the right people. But you made one mistake." Whittaker's face was unreadable. "And what was that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You underestimated how much I enjoy a puzzle." The room fell silent. The lights buzzed overhead. Then, slowly, Blake leaned forward, his hands clasped, his smile forced. "And what proof do you have, Miss Marple?" She tilted her head. "Your own—" She pulled a document from her handbag, sliding it onto the table. "Your maintenance request. Filed under your authorization, time-stamped at precisely 7:12 p.m., the exact moment the hangar's security system registered an internal override." Blake's smile faltered. Miss Marple continued, her voice almost sympathetic. "I imagine you thought no one would ever look closely, but then, of course, I did." A long pause. Then Blake exhaled, the weight of inevitability pressing into his shoulders. Whittaker's hands curled into fists, but he didn't speak. He had been careful for years, but now, in this moment, there was nothing left to hide behind. The silence stretched. Then Miss Marple said, softly, "The truth always finds its way out, gentlemen. It's simply a matter of patience." The room held its breath. Then the first distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. It was over. The air outside Hangar 3 had shifted. The night still hung heavy over the airfield, but the tension had broken. The searchlights cut sharp beams across the concrete, illuminating the figures of uniformed officers moving with purpose. The crunch of boots, the rustle of handcuffs, the low murmur of official voices. It was the sound of inevitability. Miss Marple stood just beyond the commotion, hands tucked neatly into the folds of her shawl, watching as the pieces of her puzzle were collected and placed into custody. Julian Blake was the first to break. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered as the officers pulled his hands behind his back. His voice lacked conviction, like a man arguing against the inevitable. Morley was going to ruin everything. He wasn't careful. He was going to destroy the company, the investors. Miss Marple arched a brow. "And so you made sure he disappeared?" Blake gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not at first. I thought I could control him, but he wouldn't listen." His gaze flicked to Whittaker. "And then he got involved." Whittaker, still composed despite the handcuffs, didn't bother responding. His silence was an admission in itself. Miss Marple sighed. "It always comes down to ambition, doesn't it? You had everything, Mr. Blake, a successful business, wealth, power, and yet it wasn't enough." "It was never about enough, Miss Marple. It was about keeping it." Whittaker, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. "Men like Morley get themselves killed," he said, his voice low, detached. "All I did was make sure it happened sooner rather than later." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Ah, a bureaucrat's justification. How very tidy." The officer in charge signalled his men, and within moments the two men were being led toward the waiting cars. Their footsteps echoed over the tarmac, the weight of their failure pressing down with each step. Finch, who had been lingering at the edge of it all, let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "That's that, then." Miss Marple turned slightly, watching the car doors slam shut. "Yes," she murmured. "For them, at least." She stood there a moment longer, listening as the engines revved and the vehicles pulled away into the night. The crime had been solved, the culprits caught. But justice, she knew, was rarely as simple as an arrest. It was about balance, and balance had, at last, been restored. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was time to go home. The world of steel and aviation faded behind her, replaced by the quiet charm of St. Mary Mead. It was early morning when Miss Marple arrived home, the kind of morning where the air still carried a crisp chill and the village was just beginning to stir. She let herself in, setting her handbag down with the practised ease of routine. The cottage was warm, the faint scent of lavender drifting through the air. Outside, the first sounds of the day, birds in the hedgerows, the distant clatter of a milk cart, signalled the return to normalcy. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, a fresh pot of tea steaming beside her. On the small table her notebook lay open, filled with pages of careful observations, notes that now held the full story of Sir Alister Morley's disappearance. Her gaze drifted over the final pages. The maintenance logs, the cryptic note, the lubricant residue, the air duct that had been the key to it all. A perfect crime, undone by the very details meant to make it impossible. She reached for an envelope resting beside the notebook. A letter delivered quietly before she left London. She unfolded it with care. Miss Marple, if you're reading this, then I imagine I have managed to get myself into quite a bit of trouble. I have always admired sharp minds, and you, dear lady, possess one of the sharpest. By now you have likely pieced together what I suspected, what I feared. The game I was caught in was larger than me, and I was never much of a player. I imagine my enemies thought me a nuisance, a loose end to be tied up, but a man should not go to his grave without trying to set things right. I leave this puzzle in your capable hands. I have no doubt that, in the end, truth will be restored. Yours, Alister Morley. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, setting it back on the table. Justice had been served, but mysteries, true mysteries, never quite ended. There were still threads left hanging, still shadows where answers had yet to be found. The note in Morley's fireplace had hinted at a hidden passage, a silent hangar, secrets within secrets. And there had been something else, a missing piece, an unseen player who had set things in motion. Perhaps, in time, those answers would come. She reached for her tea, taking a slow sip. Outside, the village carried on as it always did. The butcher's boy rode past on his bicycle. Mrs. Calthorpe walked her Pekingese. The world turned, as it always had, as it always would. Miss Marple set her cup down, allowing herself the smallest smile. Mysteries were like people. They never truly disappeared. They only waited to be found.